I always thought I understood what a promise meant. My father worked 30 years at the same company, came home every night at 6, never once raised his voice at my mother in a way that wasn't followed by an apology. That was my blueprint. That was the marriage I thought I was building when I stood at the altar at 32 and watched my wife walk toward me in a church outside of Phoenix, Arizona, with her hair pinned up and her eyes bright and everything ahead of us feeling impossibly good. My name is Daniel Cruz. My wife's name is Patricia, though everyone called her Trish. We have one son together, a boy named Owen who was 9 years old when everything fell apart. I want to tell you exactly what happened, not because I need your sympathy, but because I think someone out there is standing exactly where I stood 2 years ago, confused, cornered, and convinced they have no options. I want you to know that you do. Trish and I met at a conference in Scottsdale. She was in marketing. I was in commercial real estate development. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could make you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, even when she was the one doing all the talking. We dated for 2 years, got married, bought a house in Gilbert, and had Owen 14 months later. For most of our marriage, things were good. Not perfect. No marriages, but genuinely good. The first sign that something had shifted came about 3 years into Owen's life. Trish had gone back to work full-time in a larger agency, and she was traveling more. Phoenix to Dallas, Phoenix to Chicago, sometimes Phoenix to New York. I told myself it was career growth and I believed it. Or at least I wanted to. I was handling the school pickups, the homework, the dinners, the bedtime routines. When she was home, she was present enough that I didn't ask questions I wasn't prepared to hear answers to. Then one Tuesday evening in November, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table after Owen was in bed and told me about a man named Garrett. She didn't call it an affair at first. She called it a connection. She said she hadn't planned it, that it had started as a friendship with a colleague in their Dallas office and become something more over the past 8 months. She said she still loved me. She said she wasn't leaving. She said she needed me to understand that this didn't change what we had. I remember sitting very still and watching her talk and feeling the specific sensation of the floor dropping out from under you while you remain completely motionless. I asked her once clearly, "Are you going to stop seeing him?" She said she didn't know. She said she needed time. I got up, walked to the garage, sat in my truck, and didn't come back inside for an hour. The next morning, I called a family attorney named Sandra Howell, who had been recommended to me by a colleague who'd gone through his own divorce 3 years earlier. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and laid out everything I knew. Sandra listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then spent 45 minutes explaining to me exactly what a divorce in Arizona would look like. Arizona is a community property state. That means everything acquired during the marriage, the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, gets split down the middle. It doesn't matter who was faithful and who wasn't. Infidelity has almost no bearing on property division. On custody, Sandra explained, courts prefer arrangements that keep both parents actively involved in the child's life. Primary custody wasn't guaranteed to me. The standard in Arizona leans toward joint custody unless one parent can demonstrate that the other is genuinely unfit. Not just unfaithful, but unfit. The word I kept coming back to was documentation. Sandra said, "If you want to be in a strong position when this goes to court, you need to document everything. Time you spend with your son, events you attend, routines you maintain, and you need to know exactly what is happening with the household finances." I drove home that afternoon and made a decision. I wasn't going to blow up the house while Owen was still in it. Not yet. But I was going to start preparing. That evening, Trish made dinner as if nothing had happened. I watched her move around the kitchen and thought about the fact that she had been lying to me for 8 months. I ate. I helped Owen with a science project. I read him a chapter from his book before bed. When Trish asked later if we could talk, I told her I needed a few days to process things. She seemed relieved that I wasn't shouting. I was never going to shout. Shouting is how you lose. Over the next several weeks, I began quietly reorganizing my life. I opened a personal checking account at a different bank and had my direct deposit split, my regular portion still going to the joint account to cover bills, the rest going somewhere she couldn't see. I started a private folder on a secured drive where I logged every school pickup, every soccer practice, every doctor's appointment, every weekend trip. Date, time, activity, who was present. I wasn't doing it to be vindictive. I was doing it because Sandra had told me that courts look at patterns, and patterns require evidence. Trish, meanwhile, seemed to interpret my calm as acceptance. About 6 weeks after her confession, she came to me one Sunday morning while Owen was at a neighbor's birthday party and said she wanted to talk about what an arrangement could look like going forward. She said she wasn't asking for my blessing. She said she cared about our family and didn't want to throw away everything we'd built. She said she had needs that she wasn't getting met at home and that she thought a mature approach would be for both of us to acknowledge that and find a way to coexist. I asked her, "Does Garrett know you're having this conversation with me?" She said that wasn't relevant. I said, "I want you to think carefully about what you're actually asking me for, because I don't think you've thought it through." She said she had thought it through. She said plenty of couples navigate these situations. She said she just needed honesty and space. I told her I'd think about it. I had no intention of agreeing to anything, but I also wasn't ready to move. Owen was in the middle of a school year. I needed 2 more months of documentation, and I needed to understand the full financial picture before I made any move that would trigger the legal process. What I did instead was start rebuilding a version of my life that didn't depend on her. I'd let a lot of things go during the marriage. Friends I used to see regularly, a woodworking hobby I'd had since college, a standing weekend hike I used to do with a group from my old neighborhood. I picked all of those back up. I told Trish I was going out on Saturday mornings and I didn't explain further. She didn't ask. She was usually texting by the time I left. Through the hiking group, I eventually met a woman named Claire. She was 41, divorced, an occupational therapist with a 7-year-old daughter named Bia. We started as part of the same group of 8 or 10 people, then gradually started talking more on the trail, then occasionally grabbed coffee afterward. I was not looking for anything. But I noticed that I felt like myself around her in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I told her early on, maybe the 3rd or 4th time we talked, that my marriage was in a serious place and that I wasn't in a position to pursue anything. She respected that completely. She was the one who said, "Whatever this is, it can wait until your life is actually yours again." And then she changed the subject. That was the moment I understood she was someone worth knowing. Back at home, things were getting colder in a way that Trish seemed genuinely surprised by. She had expected me to find some equilibrium. Instead, she found a man who was pleasant and functional and completely removed. I took care of Owen. I maintained the house. I was civil at dinner. But I had stepped back from the marriage in every real sense, and I think it took her about 3 months to notice. One evening, she told me she felt like I was punishing her by being distant. I said, "I'm not punishing you. I've just stopped pretending." She asked what that meant. I said, "You made a choice. I'm making mine." She went to bed early. I stayed up and updated my documentation folder. The turning point came on a Friday in March. Owen had a school play that afternoon. He was playing a tree in a production of something involving talking animals, and I had blocked my entire afternoon to be there. I arrived early, saved a seat, filmed the whole thing on my phone. Trish texted at 3:45 saying she was running late from a work call. She arrived in the last 5 minutes. Owen saw me from the stage and waved. He looked for her and didn't find her, and his face did something small and careful that I recognized because I'd been doing the same thing for months. After the play, I took him for ice cream. He told me about the other kids' costumes and the fact that someone's branch had fallen off mid-performance and everyone had laughed. He was so easy to be with, my son. So uncomplicated in his need for you to simply show up. That evening I called Sandra and told her I was ready. She said, "I'll have papers drawn up by end of month." I said, "Draft them for full custody. I want to make the strongest possible case." She said, "Based on what you've given me, you have a very strong case." The documentation had been thorough. 14 months of school pickups, appointments, activities, trips, a careful record of the evenings Trish was absent, the events she missed, the times Owen had asked where she was, and I'd had to find an answer that was technically true. Sandra also pointed to something I hadn't thought to value at first. Garrett was based in Dallas. He was not a local situation, which meant Trish had been traveling to see him, which meant the trip she billed as work travel had a second layer that her employer almost certainly didn't know about, and which her own agency's HR policies might find problematic if they became public. That was information I filed away. 2 Saturdays before the papers were served, I sat down with Trish after Owen went to bed. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and asked if she wanted wine. She took that as a hopeful sign. She poured a glass and sat across from me, looking almost warm. I told her that I'd been doing a lot of thinking. She said she had too. I told her I didn't think our marriage was something that could be rebuilt on the current foundation. She started to say something about counseling, and I held up my hand. I said, "I'm not asking for a discussion. I'm telling you what's going to happen next. I've retained an attorney. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm seeking primary custody of Owen on the basis of documented parental involvement over the past 14 months. The warmth left her face. She said, "You can't take him from me." I said, "I'm not taking him from you. The court will decide where he lives. I've given them a lot of information to work with." She said, "This is because of Garrett." I said, "This is because of everything. Garrett is just the part you told me about." She went quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was going to fight me. I said, "I know. That's your right. I'd encourage you to talk to your attorney before you decide how hard to fight." She didn't sleep in the house that night. I assumed she called someone. Garrett maybe, or her sister. I made sure the doors were locked and went to bed. The papers were served on a Wednesday morning. I had arranged for the process server to come while Owen was at school and while I was technically at a site visit. I didn't want to be home for that moment because I didn't want to see her face and feel something I'd have to manage. When I came home that evening, the envelope was on the kitchen counter and Trish was sitting at the table with her phone and a glass of wine she'd poured herself. She said, "I can't believe you actually did it." I said, "I've been telling you for months that I was done." She said, "I thought you'd calm down." I didn't respond to that. I started making dinner. The following weeks were the most procedurally complicated of my life. Trish had retained her own attorney, a man named Philip who called Sandra frequently with counterproposals. They wanted joint custody, equal time sharing, the house sold and proceeds split. Sandra said that was a reasonable baseline from their perspective. The question was whether the documentation would push the court towards something different. It did. Philip called Sandra about 3 weeks into the process. He had reviewed the documentation packet we'd submitted. 14 months of logs, photographs, school records, teacher statements, Owen's pediatrician's notes which consistently listed me as the accompanying parent at checkups. He told Sandra that his client wanted to know if there was room for a negotiated settlement that kept things out of open court. There was, but the terms were going to reflect what the evidence supported, what Trish didn't know. What I hadn't told her, and what Sandra had kept carefully out of the formal filings for the moment, was that I had also spoken with 2 of Trish's colleagues from the Phoenix office, casually over lunches arranged through professional channels. Neither of them knew about Garrett, but both of them, unprompted, mentioned that Trish's travel schedule had become a point of tension internally, that she'd been logging trips to Dallas that didn't seem to correspond to any active client accounts. I shared this with Sandra not as a weapon, but as context, and Sandra noted that if the divorce became contested, this would become relevant to the question of Trish's credibility on the question of parental availability. When Philip relayed this to Trish, she called me directly. She was not calm. She said I was trying to destroy her career. She said I was going after Garrett. She said she couldn't believe I would do this to our family. I said, "You did this to our family. I'm just the one keeping the receipts." She hung up. 2 days later, Philip called Sandra with a revised proposal. Trish would accept primary residential custody with me. Owen would live with me during the school year. Trish would have Owen every other weekend and for 6 weeks in the summer. She would contribute to Owen's education fund at a rate to be negotiated. The house would be listed and sold, proceeds split equally per Arizona community property law. Retirement accounts divided equally. I accepted. I want to be honest about the month that followed because it wasn't clean or triumphant. It was exhausting and sad in a particular way that no one warns you about. The grief of watching something you once believed in get reduced to a stack of legal documents. The strangeness of explaining to your 9-year-old son in the calmest possible voice that mom and dad are going to be living in different houses from now on. Owen cried. I held him and let him cry. I told him that nothing about this meant either of us loved him less. I meant every word. Trish moved into an apartment about 12 minutes from the house. She saw Owen on the schedule we'd agreed to. The first few handoffs were awkward in the specific way that every post-divorce handoff is awkward. 2 people who used to share a bed passing a child between them in a driveway like a relay baton. Owen handled it better than I expected. Kids are more adaptable than we give them credit for. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I sold the house, took my half, and bought a smaller place in Chandler with a backyard large enough for Owen to kick a soccer ball around. I set up his room the way he wanted it. A loft bed, a desk underneath, shelves for the model planes he'd started collecting. When he walked in and saw it, he said it looked like a pilot's room. I told him that was exactly what I was going for. Claire and I had kept our friendship low-key through all of it. She never pushed, never asked for more than I could give. When I finally told her the divorce was finalized, she simply said, "Okay, what do you want to do now?" I said I'd like to take her to dinner. She said she'd like that too. We've been together for 8 months now. It's not a dramatic story. No grand declarations, no fireworks moment. It's two adults who like each other building something carefully, which is the only way I know how to build anything anymore. B and Owen met on a Saturday afternoon at a park and spent 2 hours pushing each other on the swings. It was a better introduction than anything I could have scripted. About 2 months ago, I ran into Trish at Owen's fall soccer game. She was sitting 3 rows above me. We nodded at each other in the way divorced parents do at their children's events. Civil, careful, neither warm nor hostile. Garrett was not there. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that things in Dallas had complicated themselves sometime around the time the divorce proceedings had made his name part of a legal record. He had apparently found that level of visibility uncomfortable. Trish had apparently found his disappearance around the same time equally uncomfortable. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I mostly felt tired in the way you feel tired when something that required a lot of effort is finally, completely over. Owen scored a goal in the second half. I cheered. Trish cheered. He looked up at both of us with that expression kids have when they want to share something good with the people they love, and for a moment, both of us gave him exactly that, which is maybe the best and only thing Trish and I have left to do for each other. On the drive home, Owen asked if he could get a dog. I told him we could talk about it. He said that meant yes. I told him it meant maybe. He said maybe was closer to yes than no was. I told him he was probably right about that. He leaned his head against the window and watched the lights of the freeway go by, and I thought, this is the part you protect. This right here. Everything else, the documents, the attorneys, the cold evenings in an empty kitchen, the year of your life spent carefully building a case so that no one could take this from you, all of it was just the cost of keeping this. I paid it. I'd pay it again. If you're sitting where I was sitting 2 years ago, I want you to hear one thing clearly. Patience is not the same as weakness. Documentation is not the same as revenge. And staying calm when everything in you wants to explode is not something you do for your spouse. You do it for the kid watching from the other room who needs you to still be standing when this is over. I'm still standing.